Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties coming out of the gate there, but we are going to be diving right back in here. And for the first segment of the show, I want to discuss the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are preparing to start Justin Fields versus the Broncos in this upcoming Week 2 matchup, as Russell Wilson remains sidelined with a calf injury. Wilson won the starting job coming out of training camp over Justin Fields. This was a competition that went on for a few weeks. Both Wilson and Fields new to the Pittsburgh system, so ultimately they gave both players a little bit of an even starting ground, but ultimately I do feel like more than anything, this job sort of came down to the fact that Russell Wilson got there first. He signed there in free agency. There was a verbal agreement or understanding that he would be the starting quarterback for the Steelers this upcoming season. And then ultimately, Justin Fields just sort of fell into the lap of the Steelers. So ultimately, I think that, yes, it was a competition throughout, but Russell Wilson had that high ground all along because he was there first, and ultimately Fields didn't really do anything in preseason to be able to steal that from Russell Wilson, steal the starting job, that is. But ultimately, it was late in the week last week when Russell Wilson went down with a calf injury believed to be related to the calf injury that he was dealing with at the beginning of training camp. And he ended up being ruled out late last week for the Week 1 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, ultimately, Justin Fields plays that game, and ultimately, he was pretty good, all things considered. 17 of 23, 156 pass yards, 14 rushes, and 57 rushing yards. I thought that he did a good enough job of sort of orchestrating the offense, making the plays that he sort of needed to. A couple big-time explosive plays. The relationship between him and George Pickens seemed to be firing a little bit, although that might just be that Pickens is really ready to emerge this upcoming season as a star wide receiver. But Fields, yes, you would like to see him punch it in the end zone more often than they did, absolutely. They scored all 18 points off of field goals to be able to win this game against the Falcons, but the offense was able to move the ball up and down the field pretty well for the most part, and there were some other issues as well. There were just the negative plays in general with the Steelers definitely impacted their ability to actually punch it in. There were some penalties on the offensive line at costly moments, some big negative rush plays as well. So the offensive line is a unit that I talked about before. I do think that they need to sort of take the next step to be able to get the Steelers to be more of a competitive team moving forward this season, that their O-line, along with what is a little bit of questionable quarterback play, could come back to hurt them. But, of course, that defense is phenomenal. Mike Tomlin is a great coach, so they end up winning this game even despite having some troubles with the actually putting points on the board for them. Did score one touchdown, actually, so my mistakes there. But, ultimately speaking, was a good, not great game from Justin Fields. And now the Steelers are going to be headed to Denver to face the Broncos, Russell Wilson's former team, who just released Wilson this past offseason. Of course, you know the story. It was tumultuous. It was messy. It was very expensive for the Denver Broncos in this whole ordeal with Russell Wilson. But they ended up just cutting their losses, releasing Wilson, eating all of that dead cap money, and just trying to move on here, as it was clear that Russell Wilson and Sean Payton did not see eye to eye. Payton didn't like the way that Wilson was able to run the version of offense that he was hoping for. So again, Broncos sort of clean slate there, move on from him, and Wilson, of course, ends up with the Steelers. So this was a game on the schedule when it was first announced. Week 2, Russell Wilson revenge game against the Denver Broncos, but it appears that we are not going to get that, considering the fact that Mike Tomlin during the week said, quote, "We are planning as if Justin is going to be our quarterback," in reference to this upcoming week against the Broncos. Now, this could be coach speak a little bit in terms of just not trying to give away too much information to the media or their opponents. And either way, if Russell Wilson is injured, the Steelers just have to sort of move on life as usual. They can't be holding out too much hope for this possibility of, oh, well, what if Russell Wilson does play? They're going to play the game either way, and they are preparing as if he's not going to be there. And I don't know if it's really all that much of an upgrade if he does end up being available for them versus what they could get from Justin Fields. But at least considering the fact that he won the starting job, in theory, it would be, if he does come back, great, they're better off for it. But again, I think it's a lot more contentious, the idea of Justin Fields versus Russell Wilson, who is actually better. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. But it sort of leads me to this idea of, well, Justin Fields just did pretty good against Atlanta. Not great, not good enough to steal the starting job, but they end up winning the game. And winning games is obviously the goal of every NFL team, but the Steelers especially are trying to really bounce back after what has been a tough stretch without any playoff wins. Last year, they ended up going to Mason Rudolph down the stretch of the year just because they were winning games with him versus when they were winning with Kenny Pickett. Now, it's not a totally equivalent It isn't a totally equivalent situation here in Pittsburgh because we haven't even seen what Russell Wilson looks like in a Steelers jersey quite yet in a regular season game. So we don't know what the win-loss sort of success looks like just yet with Wilson. But is it possible that Justin Fields could end up winning this starting job for the long term if he has a big performance against the Denver Broncos? Because, again, you win the game last week against Atlanta, which is definitely nice, but at the same time, it's not like the offense was lighting the world on fire. This was more so about the success of the defense. And again, Fields just playing well enough to be able to help coast the Pittsburgh Steelers to a win here, and ultimately he didn't make any of the big mistakes, which was a big criticism of Fields when he was in Chicago, that the turnovers, especially with him, were brutal, and some very untimely turnovers at that as well. And that's sort of where Russell Wilson is, at least in theory, a little bit more of an upgrade over Justin Fields, is that Wilson is a little bit more conservative, is more seasoned, and he would ultimately, be able to just not lose them the game and rely on this defense to be excellent. And that's kind of what it looked like with Fields under center in game 1. So is it possible that they could start to develop a winning groove? Again, wins and losses aren't a quarterback stat, so Fields, we can give him credit for the fact that they were able to stave off the Falcons and pull out this win, but he needs to be a little bit better. And as we have a comment here from Pooh Bear saying, "I want whatever QB gets Pat Freiermuth the ball in the end zone," which is an excellent point because it really is about just sort of maximizing those opportunities. Again, the red zone offense, not good enough for the Steelers this past week, but I also don't know how much that's on Justin Fields. Like I mentioned, the offensive line, some untimely penalties there, some negative rushes hurt them as well. The Steelers are just hoping to be able to actually put the ball in the end zone, and not even just that, because the defense should be good enough that it's really just about whoever's at quarterback for the Steelers not lose them games with bad decisions and just be able to do enough to be able to capitalize on the good defensive play. So ultimately, if Fields goes out and plays a similar game to what he had against Atlanta, I don't think that it's going to be enough to move on here. But the Broncos defense, ultimately, maybe it was more so about the incompetence of the Seahawks. The Broncos defense, I don't think is great. It's fine, but it's definitely not elite by any means. They did make the Seahawks offense on the other end this past weekend look pretty bad themselves, especially with that defensive front was causing havoc for the O-line all game. So a good sign there if you're a Denver fan. But what is that going to mean for the Steelers this upcoming season? I don't think that the Broncos defense should be this big time measuring stick in terms of whether or not, if Justin Fields has success against the Broncos, it's not like it's success against the 49ers or any one of those other top defenses in the NFL. But at this point, the Steelers are just looking for stability from that quarterback position, which they really haven't had, at least from when Ben Roethlisberger retired. But I think it extends a little bit prior to that as well, because Roethlisberger at the end of those years also was not the Hall of Fame version of himself either. And that's part of the reason why they haven't won a playoff game since 2016. So I think that Fields is going to have a huge game here to be able to sort of edge out Russell Wilson. I think that Wilson is going to be the starting quarterback ultimately when it comes into coming out of this game and headed into week 3. But that being said, it's on the table, and even if Russell Wilson does come back, I feel like it could be a little bit of a sketchy situation where from there, if he ends up losing a couple games, Steelers fans might be itching a little bit for Justin Fields instead. And if all of this were to happen and Russell Wilson ends up going to the bench, it is a little bit of an interesting situation. In a production meeting earlier, our boss here at the GSMC Sports Network, Tate, he mentioned the idea of, well, if Fields does end up winning this starting job, could Russell Wilson be on the move once again? Because there are a couple other teams that could definitely, be in need for a quarterback. We saw a lot of bad quarterback play across the board in week 1. He mentioned the idea of, could the Giants maybe make a move for Russell Wilson? I feel like the Giants would only be prolonging the inevitable a little bit. That being said, Brian Daboll might be getting desperate to some degree and maybe wanting to provide a spark there. I don't know how much of a spark Russell Wilson is, but a possibility. I sort of more so look at a team like the Raiders, who really don't have any great options between Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. Think about the idea of Antonio Pierce. The difference is the Raiders are a team that feel like they should be building something here, that they have a chance to be more competitive than a lot of people give them credit for. And while I'm rooting for Antonio Pierce to do so because he seems like an awesome motivator and it seems like he won over the locker room there in Vegas, he's probably got a little bit of a shorter leash, just understanding that he is coming from an interim coach role last season. And I feel like if there were any team that were sort of going to try and force themselves into contention a little bit more, despite where they will likely be heading in the standings, maybe they're in that mix. Maybe if things don't work out with Sam Darnold, if he were to get hurt, or if there were to be any injuries across the board here in the NFL, that Russell Wilson could end up being a middle-level starter. Ryan Tannehill is also available and free agent for a little bit of a veteran quarterback presence, but I'm not sure how much that moves a lot of NFL teams, to be fair. I don't know how much Russell Wilson also moves a lot of NFL teams. So I think that everything is sort of on the table here. The Steelers still have a lot of questions to answer moving forwards here, because neither one of these quarterbacks have really come out and definitively won this quarterback race in particular. and it's only going to get more tricky to sort of balance this weird dichotomy between the two of them the further we get into the regular season, where all of these teams are supposed to be finding their answers, and the Steelers, it might take them a bit, because I would be shocked if Russell Wilson never starts a game for the Steelers. I think he's going to get an opportunity at some point, but again, how long will that leash be for Wilson if things get out to a rocky start? But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. A little bit of a weird situation there in Pittsburgh, but we are now going to be moving on here, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to spend the next couple segments handing out grades to each of the first-round rookies that were taken based off of their Week 1 play. So we will be back with that, but first we're going to be taking a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live, I choose to dip. You choose to fight, or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to go across the NFL as a whole, and we're going to be handing out grades to each of the first-round rookies that were selected in the 2024 draft. Now, of course, just as a reminder, this is based off of 1 week of play. It's not an indictment on who they are as a player as a whole, but with that being said, let's get into it. As first off, of course, we have Caleb Williams. And for the record, we're going to be doing this NFC first and then AFC, but had to start with Caleb Williams, who had a very tough game on his hands against the Tennessee Titans. That's a defense that definitely does have its share of talent, but for him to look the way that he did, the times that he did have space in front of him, just missing throws, bad decision making, specifically in regards to taking bad sacks, which was a bad habit of his during college, that he has a lot of areas to improve coming out of this game. We just talked at length about it yesterday, about how I am confident he's going to be able to respond to this and work from there, but, you know, it really only goes up from here, because 14 of 29, just 93 passing yards, nowhere near sort of the expectations for Caleb heading into the season, and I am confident that he's going to be able to get better from here. Jayden Daniels, the number 2 overall pick, I am giving him a B. I don't think I mentioned as well, Caleb Williams, giving him a D. Jayden Daniels is a B. Ultimately, a very solid debut for him. Now, it was nothing spectacular, but especially considering the fact, like we mentioned earlier in the show, there was a lot of bad quarterback play over this past weekend, and Jayden Daniels was not in that conversation. Ultimately, 17 of 24, 184 yards, added an additional 88 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns on the ground. That Jayden, yeah, I understand if you are a little bit of a skeptic on Jayden Daniels, he, in terms of being a passer, he didn't really give you a massive boat of confidence in that area. But either way, at least, again, considering how rough a lot of the NFL looked in the passing game anyways, Jayden Daniels showed that he is capable of being an NFL quarterback. And again, his legs are a weapon. ultimately it's going to be, at least in my opinion, I'm going to need to see him sort of impress through the air as well. But those legs can move, man, and they add this different element to the Washington Commanders offense that is absolutely going to be utilized this year. Get down, avoid taking the hits. That's obviously the biggest thing with Jayden Daniels, but ultimately, I thought it was pretty good, pretty encouraging overall. And if you're a Jayden Daniels believer, this was sort of the baseline of what you should be hoping to get from him. We're now 4th overall pick, Marvin Harrison Jr. Basically radio silence from him in this game where it was very much disappointing. Ultimately, he ended up catching just one pass, and it was disappointing for a lot of people, I'm sure for himself, and especially for anybody like myself that also has him in fantasy football. But I really don't blame him for this situation. The first half was very run heavy from the Arizona Cardinals anyways. They were having success on the ground, so ultimately that was kind of just their game plan. And then I didn't love the way that ultimately things were drawn up for him. It was a lot of him just running deep, and Kyler Murray wasn't looking for that. Clearly, he wasn't looking for that when Marvin Harrison broke free and had nothing but space in front of him on that final drive where could have been the go-ahead touchdown there. But I'm not worried about him as a player. Now, some of the comments as well that Kyler made afterwards, and I want to root for Kyler, but sometimes just the things that he says to the media, talking about how it's not his job to get the ball to MHJ. I mean, who else's job is it really? But that's a whole different note there. But ultimately, I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be just fine. This was obviously a very quiet performance, though. I'm giving him a C-. Next up, Malik Nabers, the other, top drafted wide receiver in this class. He had a lot more opportunities, and he absolutely took advantage of them in this game. And Nabers is somebody that, for years now, the Giants have been looking for a true number one wide receiver, and it seems like maybe Nabers can develop into that. 7 targets, 5 catches, 66 yards. This is a Giants offense that is maybe a little bit dysfunctional, but Nabers, I think he's an excellent route runner. You see the athleticism and the burning speed when he gets into space. I think he's going to be excellent for the Giants moving forward. I have him with a B from week 1. Rome Odunze, he did play in this game. Not going to spend much time on this. Ends up getting hurt with an MCL sprain. The Bears offense as a whole was obviously very stagnant, but Odunze now expected to miss maybe weeks here. He is listed as week to week as things currently stand. I'm not giving him a grade for this based off of the fact that he did get injured, but I at least wanted to acknowledge that he did play in the game. Talais Fuaga was incredible. Maybe the best rookie that I watched personally this past weekend. Now, an offensive tackle, definitely not going to get the clicks or pop off the screen, but he was excellent in this game. No pressures allowed at all through the pass game. Now, you're playing the Carolina Panthers defense, so you do have to take that into consideration. But Fuaga was flawless in this game, and he is somebody that I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on moving forward. I have him with an A. Byron Murphy, second. I thought that he was good overall. He didn't have a huge impact on the game. I was a lot more negative on him maybe coming into the season, but ultimately he had a couple tackles, had a couple pressures. He could definitely be in the C+ category. I do have him as a C, but that's sort of a loose C. Maybe I should have leaned on the more optimistic side, but if you disagree on this one, let me know in the comments section. Dallas Turner, I have with a B, had a few tackles, did record his first career sack in this game for the Vikings. I think that Turner is going to be somebody that will have a very impactful NFL career. The issue is, at this point, the Vikings do have a lot of other edge rushers that they just brought in this offseason in Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel. So we did see limited reps for Dallas Turner, just over 50% of the defensive snaps as a whole, something that we did anticipate a little bit, but ultimately, he showed that athleticism, the sack coming on a loop where he was able to come around his defensive tackle and just jumped on the back of Daniel Jones. Ultimately, thought it was a nice debut for Dallas Turner. Nothing extraordinary, but very good. I'm giving him a B. Jared Verse of the Los Angeles Rams, another edge rusher. I think some of the pro football focus stuff is maybe a little bit higher on him than I was. Verse is a nice edge rusher and will definitely have an impact on the pass rush game. But that being said, and I want to give him credit because he had a couple of quarterback hurries. He ended up getting home for a sack on the final play of the first half. I thought it was a good first half as a whole. The second half was a lot quieter from him, and really my biggest issue with him ultimately was just how he looked in the run game. I didn't think it was very comfortable. There were a number of different instances where playing on that, contain edge spot, he sort of gambled inside too often. It seems like he likes using that inside leverage, but it sort of got him caught a couple times. Now, I do wonder if maybe that is partially a schematic thing for the Rams because, again, Verse, whenever he could, he was going to the inside, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there were a couple times where he ended up getting washed down and the Lions just ended up running right outside him on multiple occasions, including the first play of overtime as well, where he bit really hard on a fake inside. Ultimately, Jameson Williams came around outside and picked up 10 yards, basically where Verse was supposed to be. So I think he has a little bit of a work in progress maybe in that context, but ultimately a pretty good game from him. I have him with a C+. Quinyon Mitchell, cornerback for the Philadelphia Eagles. This is one I had a hard time bouncing between a C and a C+. Ultimately, Mitchell was targeted heavy in this game. Passed to 10 times, 5 catches allowed, 86 yards. Did have 2 pass deflections. Ultimately, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. Now, he didn't commit any plays too egregious. I don't believe allowed any touchdowns. So I maybe could have gone a little bit higher with Mitchell's grade here, but ultimately, not a bad debut. The fact that he got targeted 10 times, maybe makes you think that Jordan Love thought that he could take a little bit more advantage. 86 yards is somewhat significant, but ultimately, I just sort of marked it out as a standard cornerback game, and I did give him a C. Terrion Arnold, another cornerback, this time for the Detroit Lions. My favorite cornerback coming out of this draft, and I have him with a B-. Ultimately, I thought he was excellent in the first half. Second half was a little bit more rough at times. Had a couple pass interference calls against him in the end zone, which did somewhat hurt the Lions. Actually, one of the times, Rams sort of hurt themselves and ultimately didn't even end up scoring there. But I thought that Arnold, all things considered, the Rams' passing defense is good. He was matching up against Cooper Kupp a lot. Really, there was only one significant catch allowed, I thought, when he was in man-to-man against Cooper Kupp. He just got cooked a little bit there, but it's also Cooper Kupp, so there has to be some sense of leeway. Arnold definitely also benefited from the defensive line wreaking havoc, and ultimately, maybe if things were a little bit different there, we could have seen him get attacked more, but I am giving him a B- for this game. Jordan Morgan, offensive lineman for the Green Bay Packers. This is another one, maybe I went slightly too low on this. Morgan didn't start the game, but did end up getting 20-plus snaps, most of which coming at guard, where he took over for a little bit. And he was very solid in those instances. I gave him a C because I thought he was sort of in that average range, but ultimately pass blocking, he did a pretty good job as well. So you could talk me into a C+, but I do have him with a C in week 1. Graham Barton, the center for the Buccaneers, starting week 1 for them, won the job in training camp. Thought that it looked really good for the first couple drives. Then at times he got a little bit confused with some of the different stunts that the Washington defense was trying to throw at him. It seemed like mentally he was growing stronger as the game went on there. I thought he was good overall. Ultimately was not a liability on that offensive line whatsoever. Is going to face tougher defenses than Washington moving forward here, so we'll see. But I give him a B-. I thought he was very solid. Tyler Guyton, offensive tackle for the Dallas Cowboys. He had a tough matchup in front of him. That Browns defense and Myles Garrett especially lining up across from him a lot throughout the game. He ended up allowing a number of different pressures. He had some of the worst Pro Football Focus grades out of any offensive lineman in the league this past week. 42 PFF grade overall, which was the 5th lowest mark among all tackles, according to Pro Football Focus. And additionally, like I mentioned, very tough matchup against Myles Garrett and all of that Browns defense. So I do give him a little bit of a pass, but Guyton is somebody that I thought was a little bit raw coming out of college, and it's not like he screamed NFL ready with this game 1 performance. I do have him with a D+. Then Xavier Legette, final NFC rookie here, ultimately ended up being the leading receiver for the Carolina Panthers, but that's only saying so much because there wasn't a lot there. Thought that Legette had, a big play on one of the touchdown drives for the Panthers that ultimately, was able to connect with Bryce Young on a nice little rollout to the left for Bryce. Ended up picking up 20 yards or so. I give him a B-. I think that he can emerge as one of the top guys for this Panthers team, but it's also, there's just so much dysfunction on that Panthers offensive side of the ball anyways that it is a little bit difficult to fully evaluate a wide receiver like Legette. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. That was the NFC side of things, and now we are going to be moving on to the AFC first round rookies. But before we do so, we do have to take a quick break. Stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just talked about the NFL rookies from the NFC. Now we're going to look on the other side of the league and break down the top AFC performers out of rookies. Starting off the bat here, Joe Alt of the LA Chargers. I thought that he looked very good in this game, all things considered. He wasn't perfect necessarily. Definitely has to be better in the run game, but all things considered, offensive, playing that right tackle spot, he was matched up against a couple big-time defensive presences in Max Crosby and Christian Wilkins, and he held his own, didn't allow any pressures. I think that that's probably, obviously, Jim Harbaugh is going to want to establish the run game more, so maybe he internally feels a little bit differently, but I also think, one of the biggest things for the Chargers right now is just being able to let Justin Herbert shine, give him as much time as possible in his dropbacks, and Joe Alt definitely did that in this game, so I am giving him a B+, because again, tough defense that he faced in Las Vegas this past week. J.C. Latham, another offensive tackle, faced the Chicago Bears this past week. And Latham is maybe a little bit of a project player for Tennessee. You can see the athleticism, the strength with him, and he was able to move guys around on the line of scrimmage. The issue is, in the passing game, he was a lot weaker in this game, where ultimately he allowed 5 pressures and a sack throughout this game against Chicago. It's not like Will Levis was ever really comfortable, and Latham playing that left tackle position, obviously a little bit of a heightened importance of being a bigger part of that passing game. So definitely not all bad for him, but a lot of room to grow as well. Ultimately, I'm giving him a C+ for his performance against Chicago. Bo Nix, who was, a little bit of a darling based off of how he played in preseason. He got a little bit of a wake-up call for this past week against the Seahawks. Ultimately, he just never looked comfortable in this game. Threw a couple interceptions, one of which in the red zone. You can't take points off of the board like that if you are Bo Nix. And I think that, he has a lot of room to grow, of course. And Sean Payton should be able to coach him up, that he seems entirely confident in Nix to be able to sort of fulfill his vision. We will see about that. Ultimately, I think that Nix, he is supposed to be one of the more NFL-ready quarterbacks based off of the amount of game reps he got throughout college. One of the longest tenured college quarterbacks in the history of the sport. That it was maybe a little bit disappointing seeing him play the way that he did against Seattle. I have him with a C-. You could definitely make a case that it was worse than that, but ultimately, it's also against a good Seattle defense and against Mike McDonald, his new core, a lot of young pieces there, a good secondary. So I'm giving him maybe a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going with a C-. Brock Bowers was pretty great in this game for the Raiders. It's not like he was asked to do a ton necessarily, but just the receiving threat that he is very prominent. Ultimately, had a handful of catches. I'm going to pull up the stats exactly here because I don't have them offhand, but I thought that Bowers did a really good job. He's going to split a lot of the volume of his targets, considering the fact that he's playing with Devontae Adams. He's also, from a tight end perspective alone, also splitting snaps with Michael Mayer, but I do think that this Raiders offense can provide a lot of different looks. Bowers is going to be very versatile on this group. 6 catches, 58 yards on 8 targets. I think that we're only going to continue to see him get better. A- is maybe a little bit high for him, but it might be a little bit of personal bias from myself as well because I am definitely a fan of his. Latu, defensive end for the Indianapolis Colts. It was a pretty disappointing debut for him, and I am somebody who is definitely a believer in Latu in the long run, but didn't get a ton of snaps to start either. He ended up, being a little bit more limited in his opportunities. It was very clear that they're using him, at least out of the gates, as more of a situational pass rusher than a true every down guy, which, it's a good Colts defense, so it's not like he is being buried on a bad defense, but would definitely like to see more from him. Just played 39% of the snaps for Indianapolis in week 1 and didn't record any stats in the box score. I thought there were a number of instances where he was able to get some drive on some pass rushes, but the biggest thing for him, I think, moving forward is going to be creating separation at the point of attack. That, you can move a player you can move an offensive tackle on a pass rush, but ultimately their goal is just to keep you in front of them. And that's where Latu, he seemed to struggle actually breaking away. And there were some times where he was in the space of CJ Stroud, but ultimately never able to fully impact the play, there was the first play that he had that, at least that I noticed him, was that 3rd and long on the first Houston drive, and ultimately he made some momentum of driving into the backfield a little bit, but Stroud scrambled away. He ends up getting knocked over, hitting the turf, and that was kind of the closest that he got to actually sacking Stroud for the entire game. So Latu, not somebody I'm out on, but maybe my expectations were a little bit too high in terms of what type of day one impact he could have for this Colts defense that, again, has a lot of talent overall. So we'll see. Again, clearly the fact that they do not seem to trust him in the run game is something to keep an eye on as well. Was not in for any of the red zone possessions for the Colts either. Chop Robinson of the Miami Dolphins. This is somebody that was also seen as a little bit more of a raw prospect coming into the NFL. You see the athleticism, and he, even showed moments of that quick twitch that does make him such a promising player, but ultimately didn't end up getting in the stat sheet, did commit an offsides penalty as well. Now, very limited snaps as a whole for him, only 16 snaps on defense, so not a great gauge of ultimately who he's going to be as a player. And again, I think it's going to take him a little bit longer to fully develop anyways, but there will be an opening for him considering the fact that the Dolphins did lose a few starters from last year's defense, and hopefully, because again, Chop Robinson could be a lot of fun to watch play football if he does hit that ceiling that so many people are hoping from him. Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars, somebody that I thought was flying a little bit under the radar during the draft. Yes, Malik Nabers and Marvin Harrison Jr. were, more blue chip prospects than Brian Thomas Jr., but I see wide receiver 1 potential with him, and he already made, his fair share of an impact on week 1, ended up scoring a touchdown at the back of the end zone on a beautiful throw from Trevor Lawrence. So I think that he can definitely continue to carve out a bigger role for himself moving forward. And, just 4 catches in this game, but someone that, again, I am, admitting maybe I'm a little bit biased because I am a fan of his, but I think that he is going to be able to, again, sort of emerge even more so in this Jaguars offense. I have him with a B+ in this game. Xavier Worthy, giving a B+ to him as well. It was really it was more plays than I suppose Brian Thomas in terms of the explosiveness and the real impact being felt. Worthy only really had the 3 touches, but he made the most of them, scoring 2 touchdowns, and 2 of them being these explosive plays on the reverse end around and just streaking wide open down on that broken coverage down the right sideline to catch a touchdown as well. So he's somebody that I think is going to be, his impact will be a little bit hit or miss in terms of how he is able to produce for them. Or I should really more so say production could be hit or miss than the impact, because I do think that opposing teams are going to start preparing for Xavier Worthy. The more and more his film is put out there while he's in Kansas City, Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are going to have a blast utilizing him, and ultimately, again, he might not get tons of looks necessarily on a game-to-game basis, but he is going to scare opposing defenses of, not being able, like they were last year, to play so far up their secondary where, there really wasn't much of a threat of an explosive offensive performance from the Chiefs last year. This year, I think it's going to be different in large part due to Worthy. Nate Wiggins, cornerback for the Baltimore Ravens, ultimately didn't get a huge snap share in this game, and that's why it's kind of hard to ultimately evaluate what he was able to give the Ravens in this one, but he was overall pretty solid, somebody that could definitely take on a bigger role for this Ravens defense as time moves on here. He played in just 17 snaps for the Ravens, during their Thursday night football game last week. But he looked solid when he was in, at least. So I'm giving him a B-, and I think that there is a lot of room to grow for him as a player and just his overall role in this Ravens offense. And then the last one of the, and that's actually it. So, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section on these first round rookies and who you were most impressed by. And additionally, go outside of just the first round range as well. If there was anybody else that really stood out to you. But we are now going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, I'm going to be giving my tier list for the NFL, all 32 NFL teams headed into week 2. So stick with us. We will be right back after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as I want to dive into my tier list for this upcoming, for the NFL headed into week 2. Haven't done this quite yet, so the way that and the tier names will probably change week to week, but we have still some pieces away, young and talented with established coaches, playoff upsides, dark horse candidates, Super Bowl hopefuls, and picking up where they left off. So we're going to start from the bottom moving up here. Still some pieces away. The Titans, the Giants, the Panthers, the Commanders, the Patriots, and the Raiders. Now, there are a couple teams that could have an argument for being a little bit higher up in this exercise. I think that the Commanders are a team that there's still a lot of unknown there, considering the fact that we don't fully know what Jayden Daniels is going to be just yet. Dan Quinn, I'm not super high on, but there's still a lot of unknown as well of him as a head coach. That Commanders defense did not look good, though, and they ended up getting steamrolled by the Buccaneers, where, yes, you want to give the Buccaneers credit. Baker Mayfield looked incredible. He was probably the best quarterback in week 1. There's a lot of room to, there's a lot of praise to give around here to the Buccaneers. That being said, I just don't think the Commanders are that good. I never really saw the hope for them this upcoming season. I think that they're still a work in progress, that they need a lot of upgrades on that defensive side of the ball. They're without a really reliable wide receiver 2 at this moment behind Terry McLaurin. So I have the Commanders still a few pieces away. I also do for the Raiders as well, where the Raiders do have a lot of talent. We talked about that defense earlier in the show. Christian Wilkins, Max Crosby, obviously, 2 of the best defensive linemen / edge rushers in the NFL, and the 2 of them being on a line together is just downright scary. But I have no hope whatsoever at that quarterback position for them. Gardner Minshew's fine, but he is not anywhere near the top 50% of quarterbacks in the NFL. It's a very uninspiring quarterback room there, in my opinion. We saw him struggle this past week. I don't really anticipate things getting any better for them. But, so, again, I'm rooting for Antonio Pierce there as well, but I do think that they are going to be towards the bottom of the NFL this upcoming season. Young and talented with established coaches, the Vikings, the Broncos, and the Chargers. Now, I think that these teams can surprise people. And the first thing I sort of want to hit on here is I do have the Vikings in this category. Kevin O'Connell has not been a super established coach, but I think that he's on the cusp of that. I think he's a great coach. I think he's a great offensive mind, and I think that this offense is going to be able to overachieve some. Their offensive line isn't great, but they have an excellent blindside tackle in Christian Darrisaw. I really don't think that they're one of the worst groups in the league in terms of offensive lines, that if they can hold up, I mean, they just added Aaron Jones, and Sam Darnold, yeah, he's not extremely inspiring, I should say, but he's somebody that, if he can just make the plays, he just went on the road and played pretty well, all things considered. I know it was against the Giants, but I think that any one of these three teams could sort of take a step forward earlier than we were anticipating. The Broncos didn't look great this past week, but they do have some interesting pieces there. The Broncos could have an argument to be lower on this list, but I also think that offense with Sean Payton and Bo Nix could be a little bit more competitive than people are anticipating. And then Jim Harbaugh and the Chargers. A lot of people are very much on the Chargers for taking a huge step forward. I don't think they're a playoff team, truthfully. I would be surprised if they end up being that. If they do, I already have a tremendous amount of respect for Jim Harbaugh, so I suppose it wouldn't be the biggest surprise in the world, but definitely nothing that I am banking on. But the playoff upside teams that I have are the Saints, Steelers, Cardinals, Browns, Falcons, Buccaneers, Colts, and Seahawks. A lot of that NFC South. I don't think that anybody is great, and somebody has to come out of the division. Now, obviously, everybody is way down on the Falcons based off of that Week 1 performance, and I understand why. That being said, it was Kirk Cousins playing football for the first time since in just about a year. It was late October last year that he went down, so ultimately he's going to look better than he did in this past game. He was under pressure the entire game. That offensive line is not as bad as they played in this game. I thought they moved people well in the running game. That's a tough Steelers defense more than anything. So I do have 3 of the 4 NFC South teams in this tier here. Like I already talked about the Buccaneers a little bit. Great, excellent performance. I'm going to need to see them do it. I'm going to need to see them do it against other teams other than the Washington Commanders before I'm really betting on them to have a chance of making a deep postseason run. But outside of that, with this tier, the Browns are here. I know another team that a lot of people are throwing into the fire after this week, and I understand why, but couple key injuries on the offensive line, facing a very talented defense in Dallas. I think that the Browns can respond to this game. Deshaun Watson, would I be putting faith into him? No, not necessarily, but again, I just sort of look at it. They made the playoffs last year with Joe Flacco. I think that if you get league average play, that's a very good defense, and they should be able to take a step forward. We have a comment here from Shaquille Pope saying, if your list Bears are not good, they 4 or 5 team. Not totally sure what we're meaning there, but that does bring me on to the dark horse candidates, where I do have the Bears in there. It's the Bears, Dolphins, Jets, Rams, Jaguars, Bills, Bengals, and Cowboys. And for these teams, I think they are, not shoo-ins for the playoffs by any means, but could make playoffs and could make some noise from there. And I have the Bears. I understand that the offense looked a bit disastrous and disjointed week 1. Caleb Williams making his NFL debut. I think that they can clean that up, and I am a huge believer in that defense, in Matt Eberflus, and the overall foundation of that team. So I think that they can sort of climb their way up here. Again, I'm not even guaranteeing that they make the playoffs this upcoming season. I did predict them as a 10-win team to make the playoffs, so that's kind of where I'm leaning with them. And if that's the worst you're going to get from Caleb Williams this upcoming season, I think that you're in a pretty good position, because I don't anticipate him throwing for less than 100 games in a full game again this upcoming season. But other teams on this list as well. I mean, the Cowboys obviously dominated the Browns in week 1. I thought that it was a little bit more of the Browns sort of imploding on themselves. Again, ton of credit to the defense of Dallas that they are definitely some game wreckers there. But I have questions on the offensive side of the ball of, can their offensive line hold up long term? Are they going to be able to develop a run game? They did an excellent job of sort of force feeding CeeDee Lamb in this game, getting him as involved as possible. But I'm not ready to sort of put them in that Super Bowl contender category just yet. Again, a dark horse team that doesn't really feel all that dark horse because everybody talks about the Cowboys, but I think they are an outside shot of making a Super Bowl run looking in at this current moment with the possibility of doing so because it is a pretty talented roster. Super Bowl hopefuls, I have the Ravens, Lions, Packers, Texans, and Eagles. It was hard to sort of not put some of these teams higher, but I think that all of them showed some flaws in week 1 / just are probably, we're just waiting for them to establish themselves a little bit more. None of them have had extensive playoff success in their current iterations. I suppose the closest, I don't think you could really get there with any of these teams, honestly. I mean, the Eagles obviously make the Super Bowl a couple years ago, but there are still some question marks with that defense. The Texans, still a team that's relying on a lot of youth. We need to see what a sophomore season of CJ Stroud looks like with all the film on him. He looked good, not great in week 1. A bad red zone interception. Could have had a couple other interceptions if some penalties were called a different way. So I think that they have some room to grow. The Packers, they're Super Bowl hopefuls. You could put them in dark horse candidates because of the fact that Jordan Love is now injured for a few weeks and they could find themselves in a little bit of a hole moving forwards here. But I think that when fully healthy, they are competitive and on par with the rest of these teams in the category. Lions end up winning the game, was a little bit scarier than it had to be, especially considering the fact that the Rams were dealing with so many injuries and it did take an overtime win there. But that being said, a very talented roster there, and they're hoping that they can pull off similar success. A pretty favorable schedule this upcoming season, in my opinion, outside of the division games. And then the Ravens, debatably the best team in the NFL last year. I know they obviously lose to the Chiefs, but on paper talent, they were excellent. Now they lose Mike McDonald on the defensive side of the ball, lose a couple other key assistants along with that, new starters on the offensive line. So they do definitely have questions surrounding them, which brings me to the tier 1, which is picking up where they left off. And that, to me, is the San Francisco 49ers and the Kansas City Chiefs. Both of them with big wins in week 1 were able to, show that, yeah, people can doubt us because we made the Super Bowl last year, Super Bowl hangover, yada, yada, but they're still the 2 best teams in the NFL, in my opinion, and then everybody else is sort of playing from there. And I was especially impressed. I mean, the Chiefs winning a close game against the Ravens, that obviously, they looked better, I thought, than they were last season, especially with the offensive explosion that they do have there. We'll mention that, yeah, sure, Lamar Jackson ran on them a little bit. They lost Willie Gay in the offseason, who is sort of their linebacker that's a little bit more of a spy role traditionally from what they had for last season. They lose L'Jarius Sneed, but didn't even really notice it in this game. But, they're still the defending champs. The 49ers were able to dominate the Jets for the most part on Monday Night Football. And I think that, they were dealing with a lot of noise this past offseason. Brandon Ayuk and Trent Williams' contract holdouts for a while, but they looked excellent once again. And their defense is only going to get better once Dre Greenlaw comes back, once Talanoa Hufanga sort of starts to work himself back into the swing of things a little bit more. Former All-Pro safety that suffered a season-ending injury last year, that he was good, but there's another level that he can go from what he has shown so far. So this is where we're at heading into week 2. Let me know what your criticisms are. Of course, you're not going to have a perfect list like this, but I do feel pretty good about the way that these teams are grouped. But let me know what you agree with, disagree with in the comments section, as we're now going to head into our final segment of the day, where we will be reacting to the news that was announced this past weekend. We've had so much this week that, it's been hard to, keep up with everything, that the Denver Nuggets have signed point guard Jamal Murray to a max contract extension. So we will be talking about what that sort of means for the Nuggets this upcoming season. Before we do get into that, though, we'll address a quick comment here in the comment section from Cap for Life. A little fantasy football advice that also haven't really gotten a chance to do fantasy football this week, so this will be our short little segment here where he's talking about 14-team points PPR league. It looks like Josh Allen, Josh Jacobs, Devin Achane, Rashee Rice, Michael Pittman, Trey McBride need a flex option between Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, Trey Benson, Tank Bigsby, Colby Parkinson, Greg Dortch, or Jeff Wilson. Do I go after Zeke or Zach Moss or Zamir White? And then he also has a trade here. Throwing a lot at me here, but appreciate the comments here. I think out of your flex options that you just listed, I don't have the schedules for this upcoming week in front of me, but Khalil Shakir able to score this past weekend. We've definitely seen a continued relationship building there between Josh Allen and Shakir. Josh Allen, the fact of the matter is the rushing yards are excellent and he's more than capable of doing it. It's not super sustainable, so I do like Khalil Shakir a lot. I want to say they're facing the Dolphins this upcoming week on Thursday Night Football. So I think that that's probably a pretty solid option to go with. And then he has another question here. Would you trade Rice and Coleman for Devontae Smith and Zach Moss? That's a pretty interesting trade there. The thing is I believe in Rashee Rice's upside for this season. The Chiefs need a number one wide receiver because Travis Kelce, I do think, is going to be a little bit more reserved until the postseason. So Rashee Rice, he was excellent. He was sort of the guy in those intermediate routes that we've seen Kelce sort of feasting on for so long, that Rice was able to get himself open in those situations as well. We've seen Patrick Mahomes in the past go to those types of players as well. So I would probably hesitate on that deal. You mentioned your running backs are Josh Jacobs and Devin Achane. I suppose you could maybe use a little bit more depth at the running back position, and Zach Moss is interesting. Devontae Smith, a lot of people are super high on in terms of a fantasy outlook. I have him in one of my leagues, Devontae Smith, but it does always worry me a little bit having that second option as well. My answer would probably be no, as of this exact moment, off the gates there. But I understand Devontae Smith is a very good player. I just maybe have a little bit of hesitations as well with Zach Moss as a running back one, but we'll see. I feel like that could potentially change long term. So I would say no to your trade idea, but hope that helps for whatever that's worth. But we are now going to move into our last segment here on the note of the Denver Nuggets contract extension with Jamal Murray. So we will be back with that. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where over the weekend, and we've been taking a couple days to get to it, but over the weekend, the Denver Nuggets and point guard Jamal Murray agreed to a max contract extension, 4 years for $208 million. He will now be under contract through the 2028-29 season. He has $36 million guaranteed for this upcoming year, so ultimately he is going to be sitting well for these next handful of years. He did struggle in the playoffs this past season, which is maybe a slight concern, but the way that I look at it, he was dealing with that calf injury through the end of the Lakers series, and the efficiency was inconsistent for sure. He still averaged 20.6 points per game, shot 40% from the field, which ultimately isn't horrendous. You want better from that for sure, but 40 and 32% shooting splits. You could get a lot worse than that. And I thought that he helped himself out with some big-time clutch moments for them. The game winners in Game 2 and Game 5 of that Lakers series. He also, had 14 points in the fourth quarter of that Game 2 matchup as well. So it definitely, wasn't all bad for him, but I did think it was a bit of inconsistency, and that being the most recent thing that we saw, maybe makes you hesitate a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think this is a little bit of a no-brainer deal for the Nuggets, who have seen a lot of players from that 2023 championship team already leave throughout these past couple seasons, and, they are definitely lacking the depth that it seemed like they so convincingly had for a while there. Now, again, Murray, you feel like you wish that he could sort of take his game, and he can take his game to another level. I guess I'm just being too critical of this past year's playoff run, but, it was kind of just the Jokic show for a lot of the playoffs this past couple year, and it seemed like, when Murray was trying to run the offense as much, it wasn't really getting these same results. That being said, we saw Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic display that they are one of, if not the best two-man game in the NBA, especially during that 2023 playoffs. And unfortunately for Murray, injuries have been a pretty significant storyline of his career up to this point. But I think he's going to, hopefully at this point, settle in. And this is somebody that somehow has not made an all-star team. Ultimately, when you go through the numbers and you actually look at the race for these all-star teams, that there is, not really a case for him to have made it any of these years, but he is at least an all-star caliber talent that maybe has, been on the short end of the stick, considering the fact that he plays in the Western Conference, and it can be just so hard to actually come away with one of those highly coveted all-star spots in the Western Conference. But again, him and Jokic are two of the top. I don't really want, I'd say off the top of my head, Jamal Murray is at least a top 30 player in the league. I don't know. I don't even know if I'm overestimating or underestimating there, but that's probably even a little bit higher than a top 30 player in the league. And I think that ultimately, locking him down again was sort of the only decision that the Nuggets possibly could have made here, considering the fact that they don't really have any options outside of Jokic, where we see, they've been drafting all of these young pieces the past few years to try and round out the bench a little bit more. You got your Peyton Watsons, you have Christian Brown, a couple other guys that they sort of added as well in that 2023 class, hoping that some of them are able to sort of take a step forward for them. But none of those players have really shown much of an ability to actually have the ball in their hands, creating for themselves and others, and making decisions like that. It's Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic, and that's what you're going to have to live and die by to some degree anyways. Now, Michael Porter Jr. is definitely in that mix as well. Not somebody that I would say traditionally, you feel great about running an offense through, but he is, probably, if not the best third option in the league, one of. He was unbelievable during that Lakers series. Very much less so against the Timberwolves. What I'll say to that as well, and I don't want to get into it too much, but Michael Porter Jr., at least from what we know as the public, was dealing with a ton of different noise from a family personal perspective that you can sort of look on your own. So not to make an excuse for him, but he was excellent in the first round, one of the best, for whatever this is worth, a pretty niche category here, but one of the best performances from a third star throughout a series, at least as long as I've been watching basketball. So I think that the Nuggets are still going to be in relevancy for the next handful of years as long as Jokic is there. We've seen even when Murray and Porter did miss the entire year, the Nuggets were the 5 seed and Jokic ended up winning an MVP. So they're not going anywhere anytime soon, but they seemed like this untouchable team that was positioned very well to become sort of the next dynasty headed into this past year, and ultimately they ran into a team in Minnesota that was kind of constructed solely to beat them, where they were so big in terms of having Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert playing alongside one another. Naz Reid, another very effective offensive player as a 7-footer coming off of the bench as well. So the Nuggets, disappointing loss, sure. But that being said, I mean, we just saw Jokic and the fire and the talent that he has, when he played in the Olympics just about a month or so ago, that, the Nuggets aren't going anywhere. And you can definitely rip them to some degree for the lack of success that they had during this past year's playoffs. But it's not something that I anticipate is going to be an issue for them on a regular basis, and Jamal Murray is going to be at the epicenter of that as well, because again, you can't just have one guy doing everything. And ultimately, I think that kind of what hurt the Nuggets last year as well is the fact that they were crashing the paint so heavily when they faced when the Nuggets and the Timberwolves were facing off in the playoffs. I thought that the Timberwolves were really trying to make it an emphasis of, we're going to throw multiple bodies at Jokic whenever he hits the paint, that they're going to need somebody like Jamal Murray on the perimeter to be able to keep opposing defenses honest. And the issue is they need more than just him. It's him and Michael Porter Jr., who are sort of those other two guys, because Aaron Gordon, he sort of lives off of, and Aaron Gordon's a good player, but he sort of lives off of those backdoor cuts and Jokic feeding him that way, that he's not really spacing out any opposing teams, even though, he had a couple 3-point shooting moments in that Minnesota series, but, specifically the one I'm thinking of came in a blowout loss to Minnesota against Minnesota in Game 2, I believe is what I'm thinking of. But what are those other supplementary pieces that are going to be able to be prominent forces for them? Can we see Peyton Watson or Christian Brown end up, having a more reliable 3-point shot? Somebody that I'm kind of keeping an eye on that, it's probably a nothing comment, but you look at a Hunter Tyson, who they drafted in the second round a couple years ago. He was an excellent shooter in college at Clemson. He was excellent in what we've seen from him, especially in that first summer league from a 3-point shooting perspective. So there are players that, could potentially find their way into the rotation. Tyson, it's the consistency with the shot, and it's also, can you not be a defensive liability? It's a lot to ask, but ultimately, I think that the Nuggets have just as good of a chance as anybody to come out of the West next season. Everybody sort of wants to move on to the next hot thing, talking about the Timberwolves or the Mavericks, but the Nuggets will be right back there. And I still think that Jokic is the biggest mismatch against any team, maybe other than playing the Timberwolves, but I think they're going to be just fine. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section on this deal. I know it's, fall, we're talking all football here, but sneakily, basketball is less than a couple months away. And it's going to be really, really interesting to see sort of who does emerge out of that Western Conference as well. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content, and we will be back tomorrow afternoon, same time as always, at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.